Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Mad Mamluks. I'm Mahin and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Sheikh Amir Saeed and Sim. On today's show, we've got a long-awaited guest, Brother Bassam Zawadi. Bassam has a background in marketing, but he actually, that's not what we're talking to him about today, not his corporate gig, but and his side hustle is basically that he debates the concept of Islam against Christians, atheists, etc. He's been active in the area of comparative religion for over a decade now, and he is of Syrian origin, Canadian nationality, but is currently living in the Middle East. So, and he's also got his doing his master's right now in the philosophy of religion and ethics from the University of Leeds. So, Bassam, holding down the fort for us, mashallah. So, welcome to the Mad Mamluks. How you doing?
Alhamdulillah, jazakumullah khairan for having me as a guest on your show.
You had a recent post that got a lot of attention, an anti-Oprah Winfrey post that kind of went viral around the internet. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I'm not sure what post you're talking about. What anti-Oprah Winfrey?
Well, some people apparently were talking about how it's fine that Oprah can run for president according to Islamic theology.
Oh, the hadith of the women ruler doesn't apply here or something, right?
Yeah. And then Bassam went off, and I saw that shared in like several WhatsApp groups. So,
oh wow, you kind of caught me off guard with that. Well, I just basically shared an article from Mehdi Hassan, I believe, writing for the Middle East Eye, and he's just basically pointing out double standards that some liberals, not all liberals, have when they criticized Trump for not having formal diplomatic qualifications and that he wasn't fit for running for president. Yet, for some odd reason, they thought that Oprah Winfrey is qualified for running for president. So I just shared that article just to point out, it's clearly a double standard. Yeah. Regarding that hadith, and women not being fit for being leaders, I think that would really deserve a separate, podcast altogether.
Right,
because there's a lot of, there's a lot that could be said about that. But I was just taking issue. There was a particular da'i who made a specific claim surrounding that hadith, and he said that Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, a very well-respected 15th century Islamic jurist, he said that Ibn Hajar said that this hadith was restricted in its application only in a particular context. And, when I visited and, when I went and checked out the commentary, I saw that it really wasn't the case. It was just simply not true. And, I was just simply pointing that out.
Yeah.
And I was simply pointing out that you cannot criticize Muslims who wish to adopt the classical unanimous view that women cannot rule nations. Otherwise, it will just bring in turmoil. It's not a positive thing. Let's just put it that way. So that's all I was pointing out. I wasn't really trying to cause any trouble or anything like that.
in light of that, before we get into some of the other issues, what are your? Because a lot of people, when a sheikh or someone who's traditionally trained, like that individual says something, and then someone like yourself or let's say me or anyone who's not considered to be like an I would assume you don't consider yourself to be like an alim of the deen, right?
No, of course not.
So when people say that, well, this is not correct, even a lot of folks would say, well, you might be right, but that's not your place to say that. Get another sheikh in there to say that. You follow what I'm saying? And a lot of times the sheikhs themselves just stay away. Like, I talk to a lot of sheikhs, like, behind the scenes, and they themselves, like, don't, like, some do. Some of them will go on, like, Twitter warfare. But for the most part, the ones I know just stay out of it, and they're just teaching people. What are your thoughts on that? Do we have a faulty concept that we shouldn't be criticizing Mashaykh on those kind of forums, or is there something that where we're allowed to, even though that's not necessarily maybe our, even though we may not have the same qualifications? Like, how do we navigate that? Because some sheikhs who have the qualifications are sometimes saying things that, like you said, is blatantly going against like the ijma.
Yeah, I mean, wow. These questions really do deserve entire episodes, don't they? But I'll just briefly say that when it came to that specific, if we just talk about that, go back to that specific example. Well, in this case, an actual factual error was made. All right, so a factual error was made. So if someone said Ibn Hajar said such and such in his commentary, and he did not say such and such in his commentary, that's a factual error. That doesn't require any sort of juristic ijtihad. It just requires you being able to go and read Ibn Hajar's commentary and see that it's actually not true what the other scholar said. Another thing is that, it really depends on what issues we're talking about. There certainly are complicated juristic issues which I think laymen should should know their place in. But at other times, if some scholars could come, a few scholars may come and adopt a certain opinion which is controversial, and all of these other scholars are saying that opinion is not valid. Well, then I, as a layman, could come and say, well, no, all these shuyukh are saying that this opinion is not valid, and therefore I also have the right to adopt that view. So I'm not coming and saying for myself that I think that your opinion is not valid. No, I'm taking the word of all these scholars who say that your opinion is not valid, and so I have the right to adopt their opinion in that regard. So I guess my strength is more in Islamic aqidah than in fiqh per se. But I would say that yes, there definitely, one has to be really careful, especially, if someone's a layman, he really has to be careful and just, know his place. At the same time, we have to bear in mind the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he said that of the greatest dangers, or of the greatest fitan that will come, and one of the greatest fitan for the Muslim ummah would be the misguided scholars. Now, the scholars who misguide and are misguided. Now, the question is that, if we are to just simply, never question what a scholar says at all, then, how am I going to take heed of this warning from the Prophet ﷺ? If I see this great scholar with all these formal qualifications, supporting dictatorships and supporting the killing of innocent protesters, or torturing prisoners, and you have those cases, don't you? Am I just expected to just say nothing? Am I supposed to just say, oh, well, that's his opinion because he has a degree from this university? No, it doesn't work that way. So I think there are some cases where it's clear that you could reject what one says regardless of his qualifications or his quote-unquote scholarship. And there are other cases where you just really have to be careful. And, navigating that could be quite tricky. And I guess, it would be great to probably dedicate a show or have someone qualified to come and expound on that a bit more.
Sure.
Yeah. And there's a point that you mentioned. You said that sometimes, scholars, they don't get involved, or they just stay quiet about something. There's another, element or an aspect to this is, when it comes to academics, scholars, they kind of feel inclined to talk about academic things, but when emotions or something, comes into the picture, they just don't. It seems as if scholars shut their minds off, and there's a reason for that. They feel that someone else is going to take care of this issue. I don't want to get involved in this because this is just not what I do, and sometimes they don't even feel inclined to. Right? They feel that it's going to take care of itself. and it's kind of like what's going to happen anyway. And in history, we see that over and over, that many times scholars, majority of scholars never got involved in political stuff, right? And there may have been a few scholars which were in opposition to, what authority was. And those scholars that were working with authority, those were the only two parties that were on a scholarly level that got involved in what people were actually talking about on the street, But generally scholars, they don't even feel inclined to, because they just say, this is not my thing. Many scholars were a lot older too. When they talk about these issues, like for instance, if you were to talk about this issue, someone like Sheikh Amin or something, someone local to us in Chicago, he probably wouldn't even feel inclined or the need to even talk about it, He'll just because I guess he's kind of past that point. That's kind of like a young person with somebody who's got a lot of energy to even address that and bring it to light, So that's kind of an element there too.
Yeah, I mean, I could respect that.
It's a maturity thing too. It's kind of like a maturity thing. Sometimes people they're on a level of maturity where they just don't even want to get involved, or it just seems too much of a game to them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I could respect that, but at the same time, I do have a concern, and what my concern is that we're actually living in an age where you have many Muslims who are actually being duped into thinking that the way certain rulers are ruling in certain countries today are actually ruling by the Sharia, or actually, idealing by are ruling in ideal fashion. I'm not gonna throw any names now, but you had a certain scholar who was highly respected who said that the Syrian army of Bashar al-Assad could be compared to the Sahaba. And that's outrageous, right?
Outrageous.
So right now we're actually living in an age. We're actually living in an age where you actually have scholars trying to dupe the masses into thinking that this is legitimate according to Islam.
Yeah.
In this kind of scenario, I believe that it's necessary for someone to speak out and say,
"Oh, of course,
no, this is wrong."
It's
not for the sake of getting into politics. It's for the sake of correcting misconceptions.
But even naturally, if you look at it, like the people who are rebuttaling those scholars is rarely other scholars. It's usually du'at, right? Which is awesome. I think that is the role of du'at. Du'at are kind of like boots on the ground, and scholars are kind of like kind of like the head of the tribes, the shuyukh in that sense, where they kind of just teach the people and just kind of give them some wisdom and this and that. And now we can agree and disagree if that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's a good discussion, I think. But that's kind of what the du'at are, right? If you see all the opposition is usually an Islamic movement that's going to oppose what the scholar is saying, or a bunch of youth, which is still awesome. That needs to be there. That's always going to be there in the ummah. Alhamdulillah. That's always going to be there where you have the group of people. And what I've observed, a majority of the time when people make outrageous comments like that, like Bashar al-Assad's army, are comparative to the best generation, na'udhu billah. A majority of the people that revolt against that are not scholars, right? Maybe there may be amongst that group of people, there may be a few scholars that you hear of, but it's the general masses of the people, or the du'at, right? And I think, I'm not saying that's always a good thing, but I think that's just naturally how things happen,
I mean, look, not to prolong, on the subject, but a lot of people, they would say, well, you look back at the time of the Salaf, and you have Hajjaj, and he butchered, all these Muslims. I was just going to mention him, yeah. A lot of the Muslims stayed quiet. They didn't go out and speak out against him, but I think at the end of the day, I'm sure all the Salaf knew that Hajjaj was not acting in accordance with Islam.
Yeah. He was a special case, though. Everyone was afraid of him, Nobody wanted to mess with him. Yeah.
But and today, there's a lot of Muslims who are actually duped into thinking that, no, this guy's actually a good leader and he's fully legit according to Islam. Now, I do not judge scholars who stay quiet. I really don't. Even the scholars have said, Imam al-Ghazali, al-Juwayni, Shatibi, al-Razi, Ibn Taymiyyah, all these major scholars said, if one fears for his life or for his wealth, or for his property, or for the safety of his family, he could stay quiet and not speak out against tyranny. Yeah. So I don't judge people who stay quiet. I have a problem with people who actively support these dictatorships. So I think there's a very big difference here between being a political quietist and actively supporting, these tyrants. And the Salaf never, ever legitimized supporting tyrants. They would encourage staying quiet. They would encourage not rebelling. They would encourage stability over anarchy. I'm all for that. But to actively play a role in supporting tyrants, I'm sorry, this is crossing the line. Speak out against that.
They actually use the example of Hajjaj as an exemplary way of controlling the Arabs, specifically Iraq, like saying that the Arabs can only be ruled by an iron fist, or else they start rebelling.
No, that's what they say about Hajjaj and Saddam Hussein. They say the only two people that were able to control the people of Iraq. So, unfortunately,
I don't know about that.
They say that it was Hajjaj and it was Saddam Hussein. No one else was able to keep a cap on the Iraqis. Now, I'm not saying this as someone who's not Arab. I've heard Arabs say this. They joke around about it in circles and stuff, but that's even many Arabs, they kind of believe that. They kind of fell into that trap too, It's kind of defeatist sometimes.
Sure. Well, anyways, before we get,
let's go a little political. Sorry.
Let's get some meat. Okay. So Islamic Apologetics, right? For the listeners out there, Bassam and I were talking about doing this podcast for a few weeks, and he mentioned the term Islamic Apologetics, and I was telling the guys about it's what his specialty is. And when I first heard the term apologetics, I was like, wait a second, that's usually when you got some soft liberal dude who's ashamed to be Muslim. And like, for example, like I remember back in the day, somebody would some feminist would be like, your religion allows you to have 4 wives. And the apologetic I understood would say, oh, well, that's for a different time and place, and we gotta treat them all equally, and yada, yada, yada. It doesn't really apply anymore, and etc. But that's not what you're talking about. So define what you mean by Islamic apologetics before we get into this conversation.
Sure. Islamic apologetics is the discipline of defending Islam from critiques and providing a positive case for its veracity. And this is usually done through rational arguments and discourse. So apologetics here has nothing to do with an apology in the sense of being sorry for something.
Or an apologist.
Apologist. It's not the discipline of apologizing for being a Muslim, or it's not about being skilled in expressing how sorry you are for following Islam. It's nothing like that. Apologetics falls under the wider umbrella of da'wah. All right. So da'wah is more broad. Da'wah is simply inviting non-Muslims to Islam. You could pass out pamphlets on the street which explain the 5 pillars of Islam and the 6 pillars of Iman, and that could be considered da'wah. You could invite non-Muslims to the masjid and show them how we pray and explain to them what we believe in, and that could be considered da'wah, etc. But apologetics is a more specific discipline, specifically focusing on providing rational arguments to debunk critiques against Islam and offering a positive case for its truth. How you go about doing that? Do you sugarcoat the religion while you do that, or do you stand true to the religion's principles? That's what you decide. That depends on the apologist himself. But Islamic apologetics, as a term, as a discipline, is neutral. It's basically defending Islam and providing a case for its veracity. Full stop.
Sure. So
it's neutral. Yeah.
So like a lot of the context of where you're involved is, I had a chance to watch some of your debates, like Dr. James White or David Wood. So one of the questions I have when you watch a debate like that is, some of the stuff is real technical. It's kind of over people's heads. what's the bottom line benefit though in that? Because like I feel like when you read the comments, it's like Christian folks will be like, "Oh, Dr. James White was awesome," and yada yada yada, or Muslims will be like, "Bassam destroyed," you know what I mean? And what's the actual benefit of the debate itself? Like are we, or I assume conversion isn't necessarily the goal, right? Because I just don't see how that like. Or is it just a way for us to just understand like different nuances and actually understand what Christian theology is really about? Because sometimes I think that maybe we like disregard what Christians believe, we're misunderstanding that, or vice versa on their end. They don't understand what Islam's about. So,
or sometimes it can be like, we nitpick on certain things that majority of Christians don't even believe, or we just heard it somewhere and we try to utilize that as an argument, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, debating is just one form of, engaging in Islamic apologetics. You could write articles, or you could have, informal discussions, with people, and you could be engaging in Islamic apologetics then. It's not really all about, these boxing match debates that sometimes do happen. But overall, I mean, if I were to say, why is engaging in Islamic, apologetics important? Well, first I would say, it's first and foremost, it's a fard kifaya. It's a communal obligation on the ummah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, invite to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good conduct. وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. وَجَادِلْهُم, and argue with them. Okay, so it's, the actual word for argue is used there. وَجَادِلْهُم بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. Argue with them in ways which are best. وَلَا تُجَادِلُوا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ إِلَّا بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. Do not argue with the people of the book except in ways which are best. And we demand from the people of the book to provide their evidence. هَاتُوا بُرْهَانَكُمْ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. And we will then try to debunk their arguments. So this whole notion of, having these sorts of arguments, an argument is actually not, it's not something that's negative. I know when we use the word argue, most of the time it has negative connotations.
Yeah.
But if you argue in ways which are best, arguing just simply means exchanging arguments and disagreeing with the other person. So it could be done in a good way, or it could be done in a bad way. And the Quran encourages us to do it in a way that's good. So, first thing I would say is, Islamic apologetics is something which is sanctioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Maybe not by using those words, right? But at least, the very idea of it. And I think another reason why it's very important is because I think we're witnessing very alarming rates of apostasy, or observing Muslims who are on the brink of it these days. We live in the information age, and Muslims are being exposed to all sorts of things online.
Yep.
And what happens, unfortunately, sometimes is that there are Muslims who are exposed to arguments against Islam which trouble them and begin to stir doubts in their minds regarding the veracity of Islam. And what Islamic apologetics should seek to achieve here is ensuring that such Muslims are at least able to search for a decent response to such arguments. It should not be the case. The Muslim Ummah should not allow the case to be that a Muslim searches for a response to an anti-Islamic argument troubling him, and he or she doesn't find that answer.
Of course.
We should not allow that to be the case. So I think it's a fard kifaya. And just to touch on the point that was raised earlier regarding polygamy, I think Islamic apologetics is also very important to help avoid sugarcoating Islam and adopting deviant beliefs. So in the absence of solid and sound Islamic apologetics, Muslims who wish to retain their faith may discover that the only way for them to do so is by rejecting some aspects of the Islamic faith. Yeah. I mean, for example, there are Muslims who really struggle with the concept of hell. So they end up restricting the kind of people who end up going to hell. So they say something like, well, hell is only reserved for the most evil of people, such as murderers and rapists, etc., which, isn't the case. You also have Muslims who struggle a lot, greatly, with the theological notion of predestination, qada wa qadr. And as a result, they actually end up denying Allah's omniscience, because they don't know how to make sense of the fact that we have free will and there's predestination at the same time. So, why are there more and more Muslims drifting away from orthodoxy these days? Well, much of the time it's due to the fact that they are not able to find convincing orthodox responses to these difficult questions. And once again, this is a problem which Islamic apologetics must cater to resolve.
Well, let's start with the
these
basic.
Are some of the reasons why I think it's important.
Can we just for the benefit of our audience, so that they can take away something from this podcast that might actually help them with their children, because these are some basic things that every parent should be able to help their children answer. Let's start with why is there such a severe penalty for hell for not believing in Islam, that you end up going to hell for eternity? How does a parent help their child understand that difficult concept?
Well, there are different approaches to, when it comes to tackling this question. I don't think that there's this really easy answer. It's one of those. I guess our minds can't fathom why this punishment is so severe, because we fail to fathom how great the crime is that they are guilty of. And the reason why the crime is so great is because it's being committed against the one who is infinitely great. When it comes to these sorts of questions, I have my own personal approach, and I know other Muslim apologists, adopt other approaches. For me, I think that this is something that could be approached in a very mathematical way. It's not something that appeals to everyone. It makes sense to me. It makes sense to some other people, but it really doesn't make sense to maybe other people. For me, God is infinitely great, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the reason why Islam is unique compared to other religions is because it doesn't have this blanket, dichotomy between Muslims who just go to heaven and non-Muslims who go to hell. We have this notion of Ahlul Fatra, and this notion of, if there is someone who has been living on this planet who has a valid, legitimate excuse for not accepting Islam, well then he could be forgiven, or he could be tested in the afterlife and be spared hell. Hell is really only for those who have no legitimate excuse for rejecting the infinite great God. So I think mathematically it works out pretty fine. Now, emotionally, I think this is something that is very difficult for us to grasp. If you see someone burning in front of you, you'll feel like, wow, that guy's going through a lot of pain. He's burning to death. I definitely don't want to be in his place, and that seems to be quite an intense experience. Now imagine someone going through that forever. It's something that's certainly difficult and emotionally difficult to grasp. But similarly, just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, when you see people going through the hudud punishment, or you see some people who are being flogged for committing a specific crime, the Quran says, don't let your heart soften in that situation. We are human beings. We have emotions. Let's not lie to ourselves. We don't want to see anyone go to hell. We don't want to see anyone suffer. We don't want to see anyone experience pain. But sometimes justice will state otherwise, state that some people actually do need to go through such punishments. And when it comes to rejecting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in specific, rejecting the creator of this universe, there is a unique punishment in that situation. And again, it's reserved for those who do not have a legitimate excuse. So it's not just this black and white, understanding of, if you weren't a Muslim in this life, you're definitely going to hell. It doesn't work that way. So
I need you to grade my approach, because my daughter asks me these kind of questions. She's very inquisitive in nature, and she's always asking me about questions like qada al-qadar and hell. So my approach was that she doesn't really understand the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that her compassion towards non-Muslims or people who have rejected the faith, that the source of that compassion has 1,000 times more compassion than she does, and the justice that she has in her heart is minuscule compared to the justice that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has. So she has to understand the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a whole, that he has that mercy, he has that justice, and it's infinitely more than what she can actually fathom, and that she has to submit herself to the understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has all these qualities that she's already feeling for the people who have rejected faith. What do you think about that approach?
I definitely think it's correct, but at the same time, I don't think it touches directly on the concern that most people have about this issue. I mean, the brothers that I speak to, about this issue, they would actually give the very same reasons that you just gave right now. They would say God is infinitely merciful. So how could he let someone, burn in hell? And I think the problem is mostly related to not understanding the seriousness of rejecting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not understanding the seriousness of shirk. The Quran talks about all these evil crimes. It talks about, murder. It talks about adultery. It talks about all these awful things. But the thing that it's singled out for Allah, that Allah would not forgive, after the person passed away, is shirk. And so I think that's really the main struggle that people have here, not truly understanding and fathoming why shirk is so bad, and why is it that shirk, unlike all the other horrible crimes that we know of, warrants a person to go to hell for eternity if he did not have a justified excuse for doing so. So I guess it's really more about understanding, just how bad shirk really is, and how it entails a complete rejection and disrespect and arrogance to the almighty infinite creator of the universe. And we are just simply not able to fathom who it is, this crime is being committed, this crime is being committed against. And so we're just really not able to fathom how great the punishment is warranted in this regard. And I think there's a limit. There's going to be a limit at the end of the day to accepting, to truly absorbing this argument. For me, my approach is to just really look at it in a mathematical, logical way, because at the end of the day, if I cannot emotionally, it'll be very difficult for anyone to emotionally grasp this.
And I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I think that is the very essence of the concept of Jahannam. And it's almost impossible to emotionally grasp which is that's the part of the fitrah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing. Now, I think everything we just mentioned is the mindset of the individual. Even the mathematical thing you mentioned, I think that's pretty actually really, really awesome. But that's the mindset, I think, of what it should be when we're talking to somebody. Like, there's many things in Islam that have to do with just submission, right? And there is no logical explanation, right? And in the past, few hundred years, we felt a need to satisfy the logical compartment of somebody's mind to make them understand the concept of Jahannam and burning and all that gruesome stuff, even Adhab al-Qabr, and then automatically jumping to, but wait, Allah is merciful. In the Sharia, those two things are basically, they don't even belong in the same area. And I think this is the reason why, is there's a few things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us as tools to understand that we only submit to Him, right? And this may seem oversimplistic, but this is where hidayah from Allah comes in, and upbringing of children actually comes in, is that if they're brought up in an Islamic way, they're not going to need too much of an explanation. But if the Islam came later, and that's a test that's a test, right? For somebody who comes into Islam later, is they need an explanation now, right? Which is fine. That's just a test that they have to deal with. But the reason I'm mentioning all of this is that, we do not believe, as Muslims, we're just gonna have a leap of faith and hopefully we're in the right deen, right? Because that's not considered submission. What we have to understand is that this is our Creator. This is submission to Him. This is all the evidence He left for us in this dunya to submit to Him. Now, some of this may not sit well with you, if we're talking to a child or even high school or teenagers, or this may not sit well with you, but you do understand and you do fully believe without a shadow of a doubt there is Allah. Yes, okay. And there's some things in the Sharia that we have to be open with our youth and say that sometimes it's okay for some things in Islam not to sit well with you. Not everything in Islam, even the people of the highest level of Iman, there's some things on their personal and emotional and psychological level that are not going to sit well with them of what Allah has said or what Muhammad ﷺ said, right? But they have that original submission in their Creator to know that Allah is one and He's there and He's the one who makes the rules, right? So that's when we have to actually reach out to Allah and say, oh, Allah, help me understand this and don't make this a source of my misguidance. And that happens to everybody on some type of molecular level to even a vast level, right? That not everything in the Sharia is going to sit well with us, but we still submit to Allah. And there's not a logical reason for it because everybody's different, right? Sometimes the way I see it is when I teach students is I realize that sometimes the more questions you ask, and it's good to ask questions, but somebody who has that very critical mind, they have a different type of test in submitting to Allah, right? To some people who are very, very simple in their thinking and their thoughts, they just need a little bit and they just can walk in the park and it strengthens their iman. And to some people, they have to think of everything and they have to make sense of every little thing, right? And to those people, the test is much different. But, at the end of the day, when my daughter, I mean, she's not as old as Sim's daughter is, but I see that her mind is much different and it's very easy to convince her. But there's other children that you talk to and it's very hard to convince them. But that convincing process, that's there, but that shouldn't, I think that sometimes we invest too much time in that and try to make everything logical, and that's never going to happen, because there's just an aspect sometimes, and people don't like to hear this because it sounds too simple. That it just comes to submitting. And I think, Sim, that's what you're referring to, is that you have to basically explain to them the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and explain to them the essence, the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
And when you're talking about submitting, Sheikh Amir, is it always, you don't want to sound like the Christians, right?
Of course.
Where they say you just got to have faith.
Yeah.
And I know exactly where you're coming from when you talk about, not making everything too logical and everything has to fit perfectly into the puzzle.
Yeah, because there's a lot of things in Islam that you can't explain with logic.
Exactly.
Angels, the malaika, you can't do, yeah.
Right. So what do you think about that in terms of apologetics? Does everything have to be logical and coherent, or does not having things fit into logic also play into apologetics?
I wouldn't say that that we should grant that there are some things in Islam that are illogical. I don't think we should use that word. I would say that there are some things that may not be fathomable. If I'm going to discuss the topic, by the way, I have a lecture that I delivered in Canada like a year and a half ago. It's called Deconstructing Religious Pluralism. And I actually dive quite deep into this subject. I talk about, what is kufr, who is the kafir, ahlul fatra, the concept of hell, and, the different theological views and schools, the views of the schools, on ahlul fatra. I kind of dive a bit more deeply into that. I guess when it comes to this particular subject, my approach is, look, can you actually demonstrate logically that it's impossible for God or inappropriate for God to punish someone in hell for eternity?
Yeah, it's kind of an incorrect question, right?
And I have had this discussion, maybe a dozen times, before, and it really, really does most of the time come down to the fact that this isn't a very emotionally difficult subject. Mathematically and logically, I don't see anything wrong. I will not grant someone who says the concept of eternity in hell is illogical. I will not grant that. Not at all. I will not grant that about anything in Islam. I might say that, you may not fully, grasp it. It may be emotionally difficult, to ponder upon it too much. I mean, at the end of the day, you're not supposed to really think so much about this. I mean, just yesterday, actually just 2 days ago, I was at my friend's place. And, we're sitting outside and, he just started a fire because it was cold outside. And, just for a second, I was actually thinking, wow, imagine someone's hand is in that fire. And imagine imagine someone's hand's in there for like 5 minutes or 30 minutes or maybe a few hours or even eternity. Wow, my mind's just going to explode. I cannot grasp that. But logically, if someone were to tell me, God is infinitely great, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is what I appreciate about Islam compared to Christianity, is that Islam actually says that, there is this notion of ahlul fatra. There are people who may have received the wrong message of Islam, or may have never received the message of Islam, or you have people who are in a coma, or people who did not reach the age of puberty, etc., etc. Islam recognizes that, look, the only people who are going to go to hell are those who deserve it. So for me, I just trust in God's judgment. I'm just glad, for me, I just say, okay, I have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I mean, look, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over here, he's saying that we'll only punish those who receive the message. We'll only punish those who do not have a legitimate excuse for rejecting us. Oh, great, fantastic. Full stop. End of story.
But I think semantics are I think semantics are important here. So there's a difference. This is the difference that I'm talking about, and I think there's a fine difference. One is having an explanation that's logical and calling something illogical, right? To say that Islam, it is illogical to explain, for instance, Jannah and Jahannam, rather than saying logic doesn't do its part to explain Jannah and Jahannam properly, right? So I think what you're talking about is more being rational than logical, right? And I think there is a difference between being logical or logically explaining Jannah and Jahannam and rationally explaining Jannah and Jahannam, because logic, you can even be very mathematical about something, but it's not going to add up to the criterion of this world, right? Which is the dilemma about ghaib, because ghaib is not from this world, right?
Because if you apply the rules of logic to certain other realities within theology, right, they might not fit perfectly, and you might, draw the wrong conclusions.
Like Ali radiallahu anh, he said if Islam was bil-ra'i, with logic, then it would make sense to wipe the bottom of our khuf rather than the top.
Right.
But wiping the top is an act of submission. Now, you can't logically really explain that, because logically the bottom part gets dirty, right? But Ali radiallahu anh is saying that, hey, there's an aspect of submission that, again, we have to see where Ali radiallahu anh is coming from. He's coming from an element of belief without a shadow of a doubt. If Jannah and Jahannam were brought in front of him, it wouldn't waver his iman. Now, if Allah tells him to wipe the khuf, he's like, you know what? If Allah is telling me to do it from the top through Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, obviously the wahi of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying, then that's just supposed to be done. But that understanding, that's where it comes back to what I was trying to say is that submission has to exist first on that level for you to not even make a deal about, like you said, we shouldn't even be thinking about these things. And you're right. These things had to come later when later philosophies and Greek philosophy came into the ummah, and we had to kind of defend the belief of the believers, of the laymen, which is why Imam Ghazali, when he talks about battling the philosophers, he said that I wish I never got into this, and this is just for the elites of the ummah. But now we're in a situation where we have to explain everything to philosophy, and that's fine. That's our test of this time, right? But originally, the original belief of Islam is supposed to be convinced of a few things that are unwaverable, and then when Allah tells you to do something, it comes back to that point where, whoa, that place is so scary. I want nothing to do with that place. If Allah links this action to that place, I can't even imagine that place, because Allah said it's no one will understand it. I want nothing to do with that place. So that somewhat of that protective fear has to be instilled with children without making them intimidated by Allah. Recently I was telling one of my students that taqwa, they have this concept of misunderstanding taqwa because everyone relates it as fear, right? Which is not a proper a definition. It's one of the elements of taqwa, but it's not a definition, right? Taqwa it can be, it comes from the word protection. It can be awareness. It can be a preservation. It can be so many different things. But taqwa originally is just knowing that Allah is watching everything that you're doing, and you should fear breaking His boundaries, right? You should never want to displease Him or be disloyal to your Creator, right? So we have to find that balance of teaching them about Jahannam without making them forget that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala started His introduction of the Quran with Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, right? That element of rahmah has to be there. So we should understand, our children should understand that Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, when He talks about something being scary, that's just something we put in our mind that we don't want to have to do anything or any action that even leads to that place, because it's so gruesome we can't understand it, right?
So yeah, I think you guys essentially are saying the same thing.
We are saying the same thing.
Yeah, basically,
that's why I said semantics are very important.
Yeah, right. So, definitely, because when you say something is illogical, it automatically plants something in someone's head because the word has a certain vibe to it, right? Yeah. So you shouldn't use that.
Somebody who's mindless would do something illogical.
But what Bassam said is essentially how I think about hell and all that stuff. I was we all do. When I talk about hell with non-Muslims, right? For example, I'll say that they'll worry about what about that guy. I'm like, I'm worried about myself. At the end of the day, God's gonna, if He's all just, He's gonna deal with that dude accordingly, right? Yeah. I'm not in a position to worry about everyone's salvation. I'm worried about my salvation. And then I have general rules, and to me that vibes with me. I'm comfortable in that, right? At the same time, when you hear, when I talk to, I want to spend some time talking about Christianity and Islam in a second, but that's kind of my point. I want to see if Bassam has anything else to add to this, but I really want to spend some time talking about Christianity and Islam.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. I guess just to maybe bring this specific subject to a close, I would just say, it's very beneficial to differentiate between those matters that are beyond our logic and those things that are against our logic.
Of course.
All right. So, at the same time, we shouldn't just, be so lax to the extent whereby we'll just let anyone get away with saying anything about God and just say, oh, well, your mind can't fathom this, so don't critique it. Well, no, some things could actually be against logic. And, but I think when it comes to the whole issue of eternity and hell, I'll just say for me, it's something that's beyond my logic. I don't see it as something which is against logic. I just don't see that.
Of course.
I'm not convinced that that's the case over here.
Right. So so we live in America, where historically people are majority Christian. In my perception, this could be, I don't know if it's accurate or not, is that it's easier to convince someone who's a Christian to become Muslim versus an atheist, for example, just because they already understand aspects of faith and God, etc. And then I have some Christian coworkers or Christian friends, and I'm very upfront with them sometimes, and I tell them something like, I have no idea why you're Christian. Because I'll be like y'all have a New Testament, y'all believe in a New Testament that has anonymous writings that wasn't, that in its earliest like texts were like what 50 years after Christ, and this concept of Trinity and all this stuff, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And I think I tell them, I think y'all are only Christian because you're worried about like pissing off your family, and you're like worried about Islam's rules and stuff. And that's pretty much what I tell them. And they're like, a lot of them will be like, yeah, you're kind of right. Cause I tell them, like, listen, and I saw a post you put on Facebook, with your, buddy, Brian, like a week or two ago, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah.
it's like, and I tell my Christian friends, like, listen, I obviously, like, my approach to y'all is, obviously if I'm your friend, I care about you, right? So I want you to convert to Islam. I'm like, and you should, like, want the same for me, I would just think. You know, if you think Christianity is true. And a lot of them will say, I'm not 100% convinced as you are of my own religion.
I've heard that before, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So therefore, I'm not going to like, so for example.
But that's where belief, I don't want to, please continue, but that's where belief is misused.
Yeah.
They say, well, I believe this is it, but that's my faith. Faith and belief are are two different terminologies when it comes to Islam and it comes to Christianity, right?
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, that differentiation has to be made so we understand their side too. When they say belief or you just have to have faith, for them, faith just means having a leap of faith.
Right.
You don't have to be right or wrong. It's just whatever you believe.
Okay. So
then,
whatever
you think.
Right. So, Bassam, like the last podcast we released, was with, Sheikh Danny Abdullah Hernandez, and some of my coworkers listened to it, and one of them was like, that was a beautiful story. And I was like, you're a Christian. You go to church. If I were you, I would be like, that's disgusting. An entire family just doomed themselves to hellfire. Why aren't you saying that? And they were like,
that's awesome.
You know, I mean, I put them on the spot. I'm like, because if the roles were reversed and I heard a story about a bunch of Muslims becoming Christian, I'd be like, A'udhu Billah.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
That's where everyone has their own style.
I have a feeling you're speaking to. I have a feeling that your buddies at work are probably nominal Christians.
But he's their boss too. He's their supervisor.
No, some of them. No, not all of them. A couple of them are my.
I don't think they're very religious.
Yes. Some of the evangelical types are different, right? But like, yeah, the ones I talk to more deeply are like, you're right. But they go to church. They've been on missionary assignments, etc. But like, they're probably new. Like, yeah. But you're right. There are some evangelical types that they're like pretty much like, I know where I'm going. I'm going to heaven, etc. And it's all experiential. But like, and we'll get into that a little bit too. But that's kind of my own approach. And but my approach with all Christians is the same way. In the retrospect, and some of them you can get some, but the ones who like some of the hardcore ones won't even engage in that dialogue with you. They'll just shut it down, right? The ones have a little flakiness with them, you can get to talk about a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess I just pretty much customize my approach depending on who I speak to. Now, unfortunately, most of the Christians I do happen to speak to in person are mostly of the emotional type, in the sense that, you know, even if I were to provide some sort of, you know, philosophical argument against the Trinity, they'll be very indifferent to it. From their perspective, it's like, look, I can't fathom the Trinity. It may sound like a contradiction, but hey, guess what? I'm perfectly fine with that. So for some of them, certain arguments will just simply not work. I remember even speaking to, back when I was in university, I was speaking to one of the leaders of this, it's not Campus Crusade for Christ thing, but it's some Christian student body group there. And, we were having lunch and we're speaking we're going at it for like a couple of hours. And, at the end, he was very explicitly clear to me. He was saying, look, Bassam, whatever rational, logical arguments you give to me, it won't change my mind. I know the Holy Spirit is dwelling in me. I know it. And I love Jesus, and I'm just going to die a Christian. You know, he was just very flat out. I was like, whoa, I mean, thanks for being blunt about it. You know, I guess I probably wouldn't want to waste more time speaking to you then if that's the case.
I had a Christian pastor coworker just like that. You know, he said if the world understood Islam the way you did, then everyone in the world would be Muslim. And I'm like, let's just start with you first. And he said, I can't. Same thing like you, like your friend. He said that I feel it in me. There's an emotional connection with Jesus inside his heart that he just feels like he would betray by succumbing to his rational thought.
I just tell him that's the devil. I was like, yeah, that Holy Spirit, I think that's a devil.
Yeah.
His entire agenda is to corrupt you and send you to hell. FYI. But yeah, you're right. But at the end of the day, that's their. But I think you hit on an important point that the hardcore Christians, their entire basis is this experiential stuff. Oh, I had this experience. Are you familiar with that one dude, that one Canadian dude, Faisal Malik?
Faisal Malik.
Like he sends, he sends basically, he has this book that shows up at Muslims' homes called 10 Muslims Who Were Touched by God. Right? I don't know if you've heard of it.
I heard about this book.
He ex-Muslim?
Ex-Muslim, right. So, and then like, so people will get it and they start reading it. And then they'll start, and basically it's stories of like Muslims who became Christian. And it's all about like, oh, like the Holy Spirit entered. It's never like when people become Muslim, like Christians become like, you know, Sheikh Yusha Evans?
Yeah.
You know, like he's talking about like how he was at like Oral Roberts College or Bible College and like, studying is like there's some glitches here and this and that, and he's like starting to question, and it's like there's this rational journey.
Yeah,
there's so much intellectual rational with Islam.
Exactly.
Whereas when people say, "Oh, I became Christian," first of all, I've never heard of anyone who's like has any knowledge of Islam. First of all, like who did it, and it's always like, "Oh, the Holy Spirit entered me," right?
Yeah, and by the way, a lot of the times they do get these Coptics or these Arab Christians to just pretend like they, you know, were actually Muslim before, but they never really were. Everyone just presume like, oh, some Arab dude, and you know, yeah, he was probably most likely a Muslim. But you know, a lot of the times they were not. They were not Muslims. So a lot of it is fake testimony. But at the same time, I don't want to, sweep under the rug the reality that there are Muslims who are leaving the faith and they're going elsewhere. I think share your thoughts with me on this. I think that when it comes to most Muslims who are, most people who are leaving Islam, they're not converting to Christianity. They're either becoming agnostic, atheist, or even deists. Like they still believe in God, but they just don't believe in religion. I feel that, and this is just a personal theory of mine. I don't have any statistics to back it up. I may have heard some statistics on this, but I think a lot of Muslims in the West are really, they feel the antagonism coming from Christian evangelicals. Oh, yeah. And I guess that's really pushing them away from Christianity to begin with, regardless if you're a religious Muslim or not. And so a lot of them are probably end up becoming, they leave Islam, but not for Christianity. I don't know. Is that like?
I would agree with that. I've never met, like, in my personal sphere. So like I have a lot of friends I grew up with that are I don't ask them like, oh, are you still Muslim? Can I make takfir to you? It's not like that, but you kind of like you kind of just fade away. That's what happens. So number one, in the West, or in America and Canada, I'm sure a lot of us, especially immigrants, right? You come into, our parents came over for economic reasons. You're raised culturally Muslim. You're not really practicing. You're praying because you're gonna get whipped if you ain't praying, and then you eventually, like, fall in love with some like white chick in college and end up marrying her, and then it kind of just fades away.
Yeah.
And you go to Eid, you go to Eid Salah, you go do your thing with your parents and stuff. You got a Christmas tree too. You never say you're not Muslim, right? But then you just kind of like, you don't know jack squat about Islam, and then eventually you just end up like living your life that way. And then you might have some you probably have some kufri views like, oh, all religions are the same because your wife's a Christian. Or it's like super pluralistic and whatever. Oh, there's different paths and stuff, but not based on any knowledge, just whatever feels good. And that's what secular humanism is. You basically adopt secular humanism as your religion without really saying it. And I think that's the vast majority of like a lot of immigrant Muslims. Yeah, but you're right. I now here's a story. I know of a sister who was a Catholic, who became Muslim and then apostated and became Jewish. And I talked to some folks who know her, and they were like, well, the thing is, when you become Muslim from Catholicism, like Islam destroys like all that foundation of Catholicism. You can't go back to being Catholic, right? So Judaism resonated more, at least from because she was like, I think she had to go back to some kind of organized religion, and there was like, it didn't have as much blatant shirk and kufr as Catholicism did.
Well, you were involved in a lot of debates with some ex-Muslims that were on YouTube. I know one guy who...
Yeah, I want to hear about that.
Did you debate that dude, Nabil Qureshi, who was...
Yeah.
He actually upgraded, though, because he was Qadiani, right?
He's dead now.
So he went from bid'ah kufr to like, look at that kufr.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Nabil did pass away a few months ago. It was always my hope to, to have probably another debate with him. But,
wasn't he a friend with? He's a friend of David Wood, right?
Yeah, he was a very close friend of David Wood. But yeah, he was Qadiani, and I even told him, and he would always say, "Look, I'm an apostate, and my life is under threat." I'm like, "No, you're not an apostate, man. So you're good." So Nabil, I guess Nabil is at least one of those. He's one of those cases. This is where I wanted to get back and say, not all Christians are the fuzzy feeling inside, kind of people. I mean, they do have their respected apologists, and they do have, their debaters who do attempt to put forth rational arguments for Christianity. So, we have to contend with that, and, we definitely have to take, those sorts of arguments seriously and tackle them head on. And I would say that Nabil, even though his conversion story was, seeing Jesus in a dream and so on and so forth, but a big chunk of the story was also about him debating back and forth with his friend David Wood, always coming back with questions and him posing intellectual arguments against Christianity. Then he would get them responded back to by David and whatever. And even after he converted to Christianity, Nabil was a competent fellow. I've definitely. He wasn't your typical, purely emotional Christian missionary who would not know how to debate or not know how to formulate an intellectual argument. No, on the contrary, Nabil was sharp, and I had to spend a lot of time preparing for that debate with him because I knew that about him. So when it comes to Christianity. I would say that when it comes to all the religions, let's just keep, secular humanism aside and feminism aside and all those isms aside. But I guess when it comes to all the religions out there, I think the only religion that comes close to providing an intellectual case for it, compared to Islam is Christianity. And I think that's why it's, warranted a lot of attention from Islamic apologists and from our scholars in classical times as well. There's been attention given to this religion, and we've attempted to formulate arguments against them. And there's no religion, I guess, after maybe polytheism, straight out polytheism, idol worship. I guess the next religion that comes in terms, under the lens of the Quranic critique, is Christianity. So yes, there are many Christians who give that, I have this fuzzy wuzzy Holy Spirit in me kind of argument, but a lot of them do attempt to put forth rational arguments, and it's something that we have to take seriously and counter.
So, like, one person you've talked that you've got a pretty good relationship with is Dr. James White, who seems to be a pretty nice guy. I would almost consider him to be like a student of Yasser Qadhi, like, in a way, because he seems like he's listened to every Yasser Qadhi lecture out there that he talks about, and I know he did something with Yasser Qadhi down in Memphis, not too long ago.
Yeah. They have an interfaith,
and it's just like
James White got a lot of heat for that. By the way. He got a lot of heat for that.
So he's talking about like
he got a lot of heat from the Christian community, or
yeah,
okay.
and I think that's why it's something that I thank him for. I see he's not gaining anything by doing what he's doing. At the end of the day, he'll just go up and say, look, let's learn how to have peaceful dialogues with the Muslims. And, others are saying no. And it's like, what? I guess he's also surprised, himself. Some of his long, he's had very close Christian evangelical friends for decades, and suddenly they just, flipped on him and started insulting him like, hey, why are you softening up to Muslims? And the reality is that he's not really softening up. I mean, it's just about being, being more diplomatic when we debate each other. Mm-hmm. That's all there is to it. So, for me, I keep my emotions in check. At the end of the day, I'll be friendly with Dr. James White, and I tell him that I do appreciate, him, standing up for Muslims when he talks to his evangelical cohorts. But at the end of the day, I'll be merciless with him when it comes to him, critiquing Islam, and I've written a number of articles against him, and so there are times where you just don't compromise. You don't compromise your faith, but it doesn't mean that you can't be diplomatic.
Right.
So yeah, James White is one of the good ones.
So
one of the good ones to have a discussion with.
Right.
He's an ideal Christian to have a dialogue with.
Yeah. So, I compared your debate with him versus David Wood, and I felt like James just had more. It actually seemed like more like David Wood's arguments as someone who's not an expert. From my vantage point, just seemed like easy to pick apart, right? What's James, like someone like James White, though, it seems like because he understands, or he's trying to understand what we're about, and for example, if he's basically, if he's taking YQs, like Yasser Qadhi's, worldview and opinions, what's his, someone like that, what's his basic premise for why Christianity is the truth?
I guess for him, he takes more of a historical approach. So it's more of, okay, we Christians have first century documents that have been passed down to us, which tell us that Jesus has been crucified, which tell us that his disciples believe that he was crucified, and they proclaim that he was resurrected from the dead. And we also have first century documents which state that Jesus came to die for the sins of the world, from the Apostle Paul. And what documents do you Muslims have? Your religion is coming 600 years later and completely changing the story. So you guys do not have a historical basis for your views on Jesus. And I would say, that's probably one of his key arguments. And he also does have he does raise objections against Islam. And what I kind of appreciate from Dr. White more compared to when I speak to other Christian apologists is that he does focus on, the more fundamental questions and the more fundamental issues, rather than sidetracking and talking about, why did your prophet marry Aisha at this age, or why does Islam allow polygamy, and get sidetracked into all these tertiary ethical issues. Now, I mean, what I like about Dr. White is that, he does focus more on the core theological questions. So I guess in that sense, that's what makes him, stand out from other Christians, and what makes it kind of, appealing to have a discussion with him.
Right. That's kind of what I gathered too. But the thing is, like, the question in the debates that I've watched with him and with you and other folks, and even some of his stuff on YouTube, like, okay, so the way I look at it, right, is that, okay, and that's what I tell my Christian friends, like, the entire Quran, if you compare, like, so that sounds, see, his impression of how Christianity is preserved, first century documents, I'm like, if that's all you know and you don't understand it, then that, okay, maybe that's the best you can do. But I'm like, Islam, the Quran was, came down, the entire revelations during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And then we had 13 years, because now White seems like he says something like, well, the fact that Uthman radiallahu anhu, like, standardized the Mus'haf is a knock. And I'm like, no, because it's 13 years. First of all, it's only like, if you do the math, like, 20 some years after, like, the death of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Or something like, I forget what it came out to exactly, what time. But and then you're talking about the earliest New Testament manuscripts are 50 years after Christ. You know what I mean? Like, so certain things, like, me is just like, it's like, I think it's the way you look at it too, but
it's not even the number game. It's also that every single one of those Sahaba were there in his lifetime. They all memorized it.
Yeah.
And they passed it down to each other, right? The problem with, Luke, Paul, and none of these individuals ever met him. They never sat with him. They never, saw him, I think. And, that's the dilemma, that they never had contact with him, but yet they're considered disciples, right?
Right. And another thing here, Bassam, maybe you can answer this. Like, so the, like, some people would say, like, I had one of my Christian friends say that, okay, well, some of these people who wrote the Gospels, they actually transmitted from Mary. And I'd never heard that before. Have you ever heard that? Or are they just making up stuff now at this point?
It might be some Gnostic Gospels, but nothing that was canonized and recognized by the church officially. Nothing that I didn't hear. I'm not sure of any Gospel transmitted from Mary. Nothing that I came across. But I think, I think there are some fundamental, false premises behind the way James White and other Christians think. And this may possibly be due to a difference in historical methodology between, Muslims and the Western historical method. Well, for instance, for them, they always emphasize unconditionally on early manuscripts, early attestation. So if you have documents close to the time of Jesus, which say XYZ, well, then those are credible than anything else that may have come after that. Well, logically speaking, something could be early and false. Lies could have been spread after the time, even shortly after the time of Jesus, peace be upon him, and after he ascended to the heavens, and those false documents could have been preserved for us. Secondly, my bigger concern is not really the dating of the manuscript tradition as much as it is knowing who the authors were. And James White says explicitly, it doesn't matter if we don't know who wrote them. He actually says that. His reasoning is, look, it's not who wrote them which make the contents true. If the content is true, that's what gives it its authority. And it's like, well, wait a minute, how do you know it is true if you don't know who wrote it? And, he'll try to, appeal to some, some historical method here and there to try to point out why there are reasons to believe that the content of the New Testament are true. And I don't take this radical approach in saying that, we can't trust any of it. I'm sure there's a lot of factual truth, geographical information and the existence of, names of actual people who lived during the time of Jesus. A lot of that stuff could very well be true. Like Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, adopted an approach where he said, most of the Torah and Injil is not corrupt. Only a few places here and there, it's been corrupt. Well, Ibn Hazm might take a more, radical approach and say, no, the vast majority of the Torah and the Injil has been corrupted. Those are things that could be debated. So I'm not trying to take some sort of radical approach and saying like none of the New Testament could be trusted on historical grounds. But I'll just say, look, if I'm supposed to be putting my faith, if I'm supposed to risk my eternal salvation by trusting in these documents, I have to at the very least know who wrote them. At least give me an isnad, quote unquote, for these documents. And I'm simply just not convinced that, saying that, the anonymity of the authorship of these documents is not relevant. It's not something that I would buy, not for a second. As for why perhaps, we don't have first century documents which give the Islamic version of the story. Well, first of all, many New Testament scholars say that a lot of documents that were present in the first century were not preserved. They were not able to see the day of light. I mean, even Luke, in the introduction to his gospel, said, many people have written gospels. However, I'm going to write a more reliable historical account. So it's like, whoa, what's Luke talking about? What are these more gospels that he's referring to? Or, you read Paul's debates with the disciples from the Jerusalem church, in his book of Galatians, in his letter to the Galatians. He's arguing with them on key fundamental theological issues, like, are we saved by faith alone or by faith in works? Are some of the Old Testament laws still to be followed or not? Paul was saying, no, we don't have to be circumcised. We believe in the quote unquote circumcision of the heart, and so on and so forth. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. If everything was clear and nice and dandy at the time, whereby everyone agreed that Jesus was God who came to die for the sins of the world, and he came and abolished the Old Testament laws, why are these debates still happening? When Paul says, these false apostles and false disciples are trying to mislead you from my teachings, what's he talking about? So just because, we don't have first century documents providing the Islamic version of the story, it doesn't mean that we can't deduce or infer from the New Testament documents that there were other groups of followers of Jesus who opposed the Pauline version of Christianity. I mean, even Ignatius was an early Christian church father, and he had a book or a treatise against the heretics. And in that treatise, he was talking about the different kinds of heretical groups that existed during the time, and he talked about a certain group that rejected the crucifixion. And so it's like, whoa, or maybe is he talking about those original true followers of Isa alayhi salam? We don't know. But for me, there's a difference between saying we are certain that there was no group in the first century that adopted the Islamic version of the story, and saying we don't have any documented proof of that. There's a difference between the two.
Right. So some of my friends who are engaged in interfaith, they always say that the person, if you're a Muslim and you want to understand like how to like debate Christians, your go-to guy is a guy named Dr. Bart Ehrman. I don't know, you've quoted him as well. What are your thoughts? Because like I understand that he seems to be pretty academically qualified. I guess he used to be an evangelical and now he's an agnostic. And I know Dr. White got really upset because Dr. Ehrman said something about how when the Birmingham manuscripts popped up, and he actually was like took a kind of like a pro-Muslim view on those manuscripts and whatnot. But I'm actually reading his New Testament textbook, which is available I think for free on his website. I think what you just said about there's early Christian groups who didn't believe in the crucifixion was in there. Like there's all these like variants early on. So, but what are your thoughts on him? Is that someone we should, if we're interested in the subject, is he a good starting point or someone that we should refer?
Yeah. I mean, his scholarship is not open to question. I mean, Bart Ehrman is definitely a great resource. He definitely authored some great books. I would just say that, Muslims in general, I generally do not mind in principle, taking and benefiting from the works of non-Muslims and using it against other non-Muslims. So, I don't mind taking the arguments from the Jews who argue that the Trinity is not taught in the Old Testament and then using it against Christians who try to argue that the Trinity is taught in the Old Testament, or taking arguments from biblical Unitarians and then using those arguments against Trinitarians. But I think generally what's very important is to just make sure that you're not adopting any methodology from these scholars that you're taking which are inconsistent with your religion, with Islam. Make sure that you're not adopting this Bart Ehrman method of history, which would equally work against Islam. So, for example, if Bart Ehrman comes and says, so for example, he may debate with a Christian like Michael Licona or with William Lane Craig and say, well, no, you can't prove that the resurrection is a historical event because miracles cannot be proven historically. As a Muslim, you may want to just sit down and ponder upon that a little bit and say, is that the kind of approach that I would want to adopt? Or would I want to maybe tweak that a bit? I would rather, if I'm going to debate historical matter with Christians, I'll probably avoid saying something like that and instead say, well, no, you're being too lax in your historical method, and I think that our Islamic historical method of the Isnad system is more reliable, and your documents fail according to our historical method, for example. So generally speaking, I think Bart Ehrman is great. Just make sure that you don't incorporate any of his anti-supernaturalist presuppositions into your own arguments. And I say this generally as just general advice, to all Muslims. And I think this is, by the way, I think this is one of the disadvantages. I think this is one of the weaknesses of Islamic apologetics today. The fact that we do have to rely on, non-Muslim scholarship when it comes to these issues. It would definitely be, it would definitely be better if we had Muslims who are producing top-notch quality academic work in these areas that we could appeal to. At least you may say to yourself, well, I could at least be rest assured that, this is a Muslim who's at least approaching this from, an Islamic presuppositional perspective.
Are you essentially saying that? Are you essentially saying that the implications of certain lines of reasoning can be used against you on your own theology? That some apologetics might be unaware that just because their argument is making sense in in their approach towards refuting Christianity, that same line of reasoning can be used against Islam as well.
Well, I mean, yes. I sometimes do differ with other Islamic apologists on these issues, but sometimes I have my own personal it's every Muslim apologist to think for himself. So let's say, for example, if you look at the Old Testament, in the Old Testament, there are some really disturbing things there. Things like, God ordering, the killing of women and children, and, ordering, all these sorts of atrocities to be committed against, all these populations and et cetera. So, a lot of Muslims, do jump on that and say, look at the God of the New Testament is the same God of the Old Testament, and look how brutal and cruel your God in the Old Testament is. I tend to not really adopt that approach. I do try my best to stay away from debating ethics.
Well, it can be used against us because of Ad and Thamud and of Lut alayhi salam.
Allah doesn't send, like in the verses of the Quran, Allah doesn't send azab.
And they actually do. Some Christians actually do respond in turn by pointing. They would say, well, Khidr, killed that boy, didn't he? To prove a point, right?
Yep.
So they would counter back and say stuff like that. Even though I think, in my opinion, that the Old Testament atrocities are quite incomparable to even those examples.
Yeah.
It's still my.
It still is a distraction, though.
I think that these are tertiary issues.
Yeah.
And I put I put a note on my website. It's always been there, and I never removed it. I have a section on Old Testament atrocities. So I actually have articles written showing where God ordered women to be raped in the Old Testament. God ordered children to be killed in the Old Testament, and God ordered, a lot of disturbing things in the Old Testament. And I just put a note up there and said, look, I only urge Muslims to use these arguments only to point out the double standards of Christians who would reject Islam for things that they find morally objectionable.
Yeah.
But don't use these to just go and bash Christians. I mean, that's just distracting us from the key fundamental issues. Other Muslims, may disagree with me, and that's fine. It's just my personal opinion.
And what I think is really important is that we see when there's an argument, like just last night, I was watching this debate between Sean Hannity and Christopher Hitchens, right? And Sean Hannity kind of talked about just the cosmos, kind of like what a Muslim would say. You think that the cosmos, it came into existence without any energy. He started talking about energy. To initiate this energy, there had to be an energy. But Christopher Hitchens, I don't like giving him too much credit. But he's a good debater. He keeps his composure. He's an eloquent speaker and a debater. But one thing that I realize with him and all the New Age atheists and a lot of evangelicals, it's that same thing. When you're talking about original creation of the world and the cosmos and the celestial bodies in the universe, they start immediately making you defensive by talking about the negative things and blood and gore and God being this and that and not having brains, not being able to think for himself. And that makes a person, they once they react to that argument, then the Christopher Hitchens and the atheists have won their argument. That's what they want. They want to put you in that, but they're not actually talking about. They don't like sticking to that, and even though sometimes they do. But we, as Muslims, we have to make sure that we don't get outside of the realm of belief, right? Once we start even getting into fiqh and we're not qualified in fiqh and we talk about this and that, then it becomes a little it breaks the morale of the da'i, right? Because they're not sticking to what they're originally supposed to stick to, which is just the belief system, the intellectual level of how we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right. And I think that helps if we're able to differentiate, and even at that time of emotion when you're trying to quote unquote defend Islam, when somebody asks a question like that from left field, you have to be able to stop that question and stick to the belief questions, right? And that narrows everything down. It limits everything. And it actually, what can end up being a 3-hour debate, you can actually do that within 20 minutes. Because a lot of these debates end up with offshoot things, about, women's inheritance and the marriage of Aisha radiallahu anha and the killing of, this and the wars. And you can avoid all of that just by sticking to the belief, and that it's demoralizing for the person who came with all these questions that's come to debate you because he thought he was going to get, he thought he was going to, defeat you by talking about all these things. And I think that's really, really important too, man.
I mean, you're really spot on. You're really spot on there. I mean, this is really one of the main reasons why I'm actually doing the degree that I am in right now. Philosophy of religion and ethics. I mean, from my experience, the dominant bulk of arguments raised against Islam are ethical objections.
Yes,
that's all they are. On gender equality, punishments in Islamic law.
And it's almost like nonsensical. I'm sorry to cut you off again. It's almost like nonsensical. Yeah. You're talking about belief, and all of a sudden they just talk about, God said this about women. And it's almost like we've accepted this this type of the style of debate of bringing things that are not even related to the topic, and we fall into that trap of debating it.
Yeah, remember that Christian pastor at my work that I was talking about earlier? Yeah. He was bringing up these same issues, like the marriage of Aisha, the killing of the Jews in Khaybar. And I said, okay, well, you have like 10, 15 questions. I can sit down and answer all these questions for you. But will you be ready to accept Islam after this? And he said, no. And I'm like, okay, well, what's the issue here then?
Yeah.
So then we got into the theological aspect of why the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Tawheed is more superior to the Christian understanding of belief in one God. So.
And you know what? One thing that we have to actually be a slightly more aggressive in a positive way. When people bring up these things about women and even about hijab and how they're oppressed, as soon as they ask that question, we have to make a habit of not talking about that issue they have and rather bringing them into belief. And talking about belief, we say, okay, you know what? Exactly what you said, Sim. If I answer all these questions for you, are you going to become a Muslim? They're not, right? And what we have to do is, think about how many years people convince non-Muslims that Islam isn't oppressive towards women. It could be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. But what happens at the end of that 4 years once you've convinced Bob that Islam is not oppressive towards women? After 4 years, 5 years, he's like, okay, Islam is not oppressive towards women. But he doesn't know anything about your belief system. He hasn't become Muslim after. He hasn't even contemplated, his submission to his creator and his purpose of his existence, right? So that becomes problematic too. So even when people ask us questions about these problematic issues, we have to be articulate in a manner where we automatically bring it to the belief. Because we should say to them, listen, let's talk about the origins. Let's talk about the origin story. Once you're convinced of the origin story, these questions are not going to matter to you anymore because that's a higher priority, right? And I think we have to be aggressive in that way. We've become so
You ever play Mario Kart?
Yeah, maybe when I was 5 years old.
When you're chasing after Mario or whoever, and they drop a banana peel, and then you slip out. Yeah. That's what they're doing when you're engaging in dialogue. Your car.
Hey, bro, we warned you. We warned you. We're going to give you examples, bro.
So that's exactly what they do when they throw out these issues about Aisha and things like that. Yeah. They're just throwing a little banana peel in your way. Yeah. They don't want to really discuss the main problem with their theology.
Yeah, and maybe in all fairness, maybe they haven't even thought about it at the level that we know it as, because this is what they're just thinking. I'm here to defeat him, and a lot of times they probably don't even have love. When people don't have love for the deen, they just want to win over somebody, and they want the rest of the crowd to see that, hey, we defeated this person. That's what debate is all about, right?
So, closing things off, Brother Bassam, what is your response to some of the detractors about apologetics, that that this isn't really changing anything, and that we can debate with them till the day of judgment, but they won't change.
Let them go to hell, Yanni.
Yanni, why do you have to throw Yanni in there all of a sudden? Like, is that supposed to add some type of emphasis to our argument? Just throw Yanni in there.
It's something I heard something from Imam Suhaib. Old, like, vintage Imam Suhaib was like, he said some quote one time, he was like joking, he was like, they're kuffar, yani, let them go to hell. Back when Imam Suhaib had that big beard going, like early 2000s.
We'll probably
right?
have to edit this part.
No, it's fine. That lecture is still available on YouTube, on aswadislam.net. I can like link it.
Aswat Islam, you still visit that website? Anyways, go ahead. That's from the 90s.
Well, I would just say from experience, there are a lot of sincere people out there. I do speak to them. I've come across many of them. There are a lot of sincere brothers who are sincerely seeking the truth, and they truly are confused by a lot of these arguments that are being lodged against Islam. And again, it's our duty, even if the idea, the idea here isn't to just simply engage in Islamic apologetics so that you could convince non-Muslims to convert to Islam. It's also to strengthen the iman of people who already are Muslims. You need to let Islam stand out as an intellectually viable option. And if you don't have rational arguments bolstering the position of Islam as an intellectual stance to adopt, well, then it's really going to lose its appeal, with many people. And I know that debating and engaging in directly engaging in apologetics is probably not for all Muslims. I'm not saying that it's for everyone, but there are ways your average Muslim could contribute to Islamic apologetics. For instance, if perhaps you could use your professional expertise to support Islamic apologetics. Let's say, for example, you specialize in marketing and in SEO optimization, for example. You know how to drive up website rankings. Well, why not offer your services to an Islamic apologist and help him get more exposure to his website, for example. Or if you're good at video editing and filming, why not support Muslim apologists who want to get more YouTube views by using more creative and animated videos, for example. You could donate. There are a number of Muslim apologists who are, looking for patrons to donate a small amount every month. They need to purchase books. They need to subscribe to scholarly journals, to assist them with their research. Why not do your part? And maybe perhaps donate something, to some of these apologetics organizations. You have organizations like, IERA or Muslim Debate Initiative, or maybe even the Yaqeen Institute. Why not consider supporting these projects? Translations, I have people from time to time who email me and they say, well, we'd like to volunteer and translate some of your articles into Italian or Spanish or Dutch. I even had someone say, offer to translate to Hebrew once. It was this Jewish convert lady to Islam. I tell them, look, you know better than me which articles should be translated. So, so someone could come and tell me, okay, look, we don't have a good article in German which defends criticisms of the Quran's preservation, for example. So I'll tell them, okay, so I could recommend to you a good English article to translate into German, but at least translate it. So I think translations, we need a lot of manpower when it comes to translating, apologetics works into different languages. There's a lot of great work being done in Arabic that is not found in English. There's a lot of great work done in English that's not found in French. So, these are some of the ways that, that many, this is one of the ways that many of us, Muslim laymen can try to contribute to Islamic apologetics, even if we're not interested in engaging in those sorts of discussions directly ourselves. So, there's definitely a lot that we could do. If I could just leave, leave everyone with this one thought. I just want everyone to, bear in mind and remember that Islam isn't merely a culture to us Muslims. All right. So when we see a Muslim leaving Islam or having doubts about Islam, it's not simply a matter of him or her shifting cultures. This isn't something that we should be taking lightly. God forbid, one day it could be a family member or it could be a close friend of yours who could fall as an intellectual victim to the attacks against Islam. And I don't need to emphasize, what sort of everlasting consequences that could have in the hereafter. So we need to do what we can. We need to ask the imams at our masajid to start an apologetics program, or perhaps invite respected apologists to conduct workshops, for the Muslims. Convince our MSAs to do the same. If we're students of knowledge and we're, studying under Muslim scholars, we should encourage them to get involved in Islamic apologetics as well. Let them know what's happening on the ground. Let them digest how serious, this intellectual war being waged against Islam is, and that they are needed to play an active role, in this arena. And, and finally, we should always remember winning arguments, doesn't necessarily equate to winning minds and hearts. All right. I mean, this isn't simply about arguing for the sake of it, but rather, letting Islam's glory and beauty shine to those who desperately need it, and I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, gives us success.
I mean, and I think even what you're doing with the masters, it seems like, some people are going to ask questions to us afterwards, like, hey, if you have an undergrad degree in like marketing and you can go and do, graduate work. It's something that when we talked to Jack Brown, the first time, he said that he doesn't recommend people go and do PhD Islamic studies. Like, what y'all should do is like learn Islam, learn from the ulama, but then get your graduate work or your PhD in like Western Civ, and like it's almost like reverse Orientalism in a sense, right? Because you mentioned a little bit ago about Ehrman and like how we got to rely on Ehrman for that. But what if like we had, I don't know, what if we had like an Islamic scholar or someone who was like who had a grounding in Islam, but then like pursued a PhD in like Christian theology? And I know like
I think that's great. I support that. I mean, look, for me, I waited at least a decade of, of extensive Aqidah study before I touched this philosophy degree that I'm doing in ethics and religion. And trust me, I mean, as I'm reading through a lot of the literature that I'm going through right now, I always tell myself, wow, thank God I didn't do this when I was 20. This would have really messed me up. It's definitely, not something that I would just encourage anyone to just, go ahead and do. I mean, I do have a mentor, that I do look up to, when it comes to, Aqidah. And if I ever have, any doubts, I just speak to him on WhatsApp and I consult him. So, I try my best to be careful, before I, dive deep into, into such waters. But I do believe it's important to familiarize yourself with the best of scholarship on the subject that you're trying to deal with. All right. So if you're a Muslim who wants to tackle the issue of evolution, I think you should have formal qualifications in biology. And if you want to deal with the Orientalist attacks on against the Hadith science, against Hadith, I think you should, have some formal qualifications, or at least have studied informally under qualified scholars, in depth, ulum al-Hadith, and at least have mentors or specialists in Hadith that you could always consult when you need help. I think it's important that we engage, that we actually engage with their scholarship and know what they have to offer and know the literature, if we want to have any credibility when we debate with others. I mean, just to briefly elaborate on why I decided to do a master's in philosophy of religion and ethics. I mean, it's just something that we were just touching upon earlier. All these ethical objections that, we're getting against Islam, they're all distractions. most Muslim apologists do tend to address these sorts of objections head on. And, I don't have anything against that. I think we should address all these arguments head on. Why did the Prophet marry Aisha at that age? Why did the Muslims execute the Jews and Bani Qurayza, et cetera, et cetera? I think we should tackle those. But, much of the time we do forget about the ontological or foundational basis of morality to begin with. I mean, on what basis do you think that strict and absolute gender egalitarianism is correct? On what basis are you saying that the Islamic hudud are unfair and too harsh? What's your moral standard? It's very important that we clearly lay out what our presumptions are on this critical subject. What moral theory do you adopt? Are you a consequentialist who places extra emphasis on positive consequences? Or are you a deontologist who places extra emphasis on duties regardless of consequences? Or do you believe in a divine command theory where you think that only what God commands and forbids is good and evil and that humans can't decide what is good and evil? Or is there a more nuanced view? I think it's very important to have this question settled before debating all these tertiary ethical questions. And so for me, by majoring in this degree that I'm doing right now, I'm familiarizing myself with the scholarship out there pertaining to these questions. And I hope, inshallah, to use what I learned for the benefit of Islamic apologetics. And, it's not something that I'm pursuing as a career. I personally don't like to interlink my income with my faith. I do not ask for donations. I do not ask for, I don't want to, it's not something that I want to do full time and get a paid salary for. It's something I'm doing, in my spare time. And that means less pressure on me. That does mean less pressure on me. So, I could, sit there and disagree with my pro-abortionist feminist professor. I could disagree with my pro-active euthanasia professor. And, because,
you ain't worried about tenure.
Yeah, I don't care about tenure.
Yeah, right.
And I'm not, and, and for me, I do want to get good grades. But at the end of the day, if as long as I'm familiar with the scholarship out there and I'm critically learning what I need to learn for the purpose of Islamic apologetics, I'm fully satisfied. And that's what I encourage others to do after having a solid grounding in Islam. I waited 10 years, 12 years, before I went ahead and took this degree. So I don't encourage others, I don't flat out encourage others to just go ahead and do Western degrees, in philosophy and so on and so forth. I mean, it depends on the case by case scenario, but overall, I think if someone has a solid grounding in Islam and he's confident that he could go ahead and do this degree, then yeah, I think that's great. The more knowledge we have and the more familiar we are with scholarship, the more we're able to sharpen our arguments and, better enhance our articulation of our arguments. I think that's fantastic. And I think that's what Islamic apologetics really needs.
Cool. Sounds good. Well, Jazakallah khair. And people can find out more about your work at www.call-to-monotheism.com, and we'll have that linked in the show notes. Again, we appreciate you. I know where you're at in part of the world. It's a little late, so appreciate you staying up with us today, and hope to hear from you soon. For our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments, you can email us at themadmamluks@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Leave us a 5-star review on iTunes and subscribe, and let your friends know about us. And we are soliciting donations, so you can go to www.themadmamluks.com and donate through PayPal. This operation, again, as we always say, we don't make money off this. This is not our day job. We all have something else in this. This is kind of like a side thing. So help us support it so we can put out the weekly content that we do. For our special guest, Bassam Zawadi, and my co-hosts, Sheikh Amr Saeed and Sim, this is Mahin signing off for the Mad Mamluks. Assalamu alaikum.